Chapter 13 Siberia High-Rises on the Permafrost. I am not for the sweetly timid daydreamers, childish in their complacency. I am for those who are willing to fight, not for those who resort to prayer, for idealists of action, for those who have undertaken to change the world. Yevtushchenko envoys are going to Lenin. Russians are connoisseurs of the cold. They relish the onset of winter, when snow magically transforms the drab gray visage of a city like Moscow into a lighter, more pleasant countenance by dusting the rooftops and window ledges with a fresh coat of white trim, badly needed in any season. After the rainy, funeral pall of autumn, I myself came to welcome the liberation of winter with its brief but brilliant sunshine, its stunning azure skies, and its clear, invigorating coldness. I had to be cautioned, however, lest I be misled by its false beginnings. In my amazement at the heavy 9-inch snowfall in mid-October during my first year in Moscow, I wrote a story about the early arrival of winter, but Ivan Gusev, our office driver, quoted the peasant lore that winter comes only after the third snowfall, and I should not be fooled by its first feint. Sure enough, those 9 inches turned to ugly slush and disappeared. So did the second snowfall. When the third came, it piled up and packed down, and the Russians exulted in the squealing of the hard pack under their heels and the frost crystals that webbed their window panes, firmly taped shut for the hibernation from early November to late April. In our courtyard, the drivers fidgeted over bulky engines and laughingly pouring precious vodka into the radiator of one machine, which had somehow escaped more modern prophylactics, would gather in council to consider and savor the first hard frost. Skolko Gradusov. How many degrees, one would ask. When winter truly arrives, Russians never ask what the temperature is, only how many degrees. Degrees below freezing is taken for granted. The other drivers would sniff the air with animal satisfaction, as if that first hard frost had a fragrance akin to the first bloom of spring, then pronounce their verdicts and compare them with the morning weather reports. As our first Moscow winter began, I was surprised to see that rather than retreating indoors, Russians would emerge and flood the buses or suburban commuter trains with cross-country skis slung over their shoulders and journey into the nearby countryside, where they darted off among the sun-dappled birches. The hardier menfolk would hike out on the frozen rivers, laboriously bore holes through the ice, and squat all day watching their lines. That was one of Ivan's favorite sports. Whenever I would kid him about coming home with a pitiful catch of no more than a cupful of minnows, he would grin and reply that he went not so much for the fish, but to get out in the country during winter. Always, too, Russians had a tale of a place farther north or farther inland, where the frost was harder, the freeze stronger, the air drier, the people tougher. If ever, as a foreign neophyte, I were to comment on the chilliness of the morning to the drivers in the courtyard, one of them was sure to humorously advise that in Siberia spit froze before it hit the ground, or that a Siberian toilet consisted of just one implement. What, I would innocently ask? A stick to beat off the wolves, would come the reply amidst a chorus of laughter. Braving the cold, like downing vodka, is part of the machismo ritual for Russians, women as well as men. One morning in February, when winter grudgingly relaxed its grip temporarily, 60 walruses, as Russians call their winter swimmers, took advantage of the balmy 30-degree weather for a bracing dip among the ice floes in the Moscow River. At Gorky Park, I was among hundreds of ice skaters who paused to watch the middle-aged and white-haired bathers come out of the change house in swimming caps and skimpy trunks. It made me shiver to see them march, nearly naked across the ice and snow to the river bank, and then plunge one by one into the murky brown water. A few gamely performed the crawl, but most kept their heads above water, and dog-paddled or breaststroked as long as they could stand it. A sailor in uniform drew cheers when he jumped in, fully clothed. Several middle-aged women paddled slowly beside a rowboat for photographers. "See how strong and healthy our walruses are," gushed an enthusiastic announcer to the fur-capped throngs on the river bank. "They must be out of their minds," a warmly dressed militia captain mumbled. It all seemed like child's play. However, when I flew to Yakutsk in eastern Siberia, a city as far north as Anchorage, Alaska, yet colder because it is locked in the continental fastness without the moderating influence of a nearby ocean, Yakutsk is the capital of the Soviet Klondike, hard by the Arctic Circle. Fittingly, Eric Damani, a British correspondent, once called it the end of the line, except that there is no line to be the end of. The nearest trunk railroad is 1,200 miles to the south, yet here too the Siberiaki, as devoted Siberians call themselves, take a certain masochistic pride in the rigors of winter and their ability to endure. I remember a brisk wintry walk through Yakutsk and one day with two Soviet acquaintances. From the brooding emptiness of the North Siberian plain came a piercing wind that burned the cheeks and froze the nostrils. Not a howling blast, but silent and sharp as a knife. Tears welled up in the eyes, and gloved fingers flexed instinctively. It was mid-March, but even a bright sun could not lift the temperature higher than 13 below zero. It was a greedy, confident Siberian winteriness, devouring the hardy folk who labored along the sidewalks and chased indoors those whose energies it had already eaten away. The day before, in one cafe, I had seen people banging through the door steadily, taking refuge over piping hot tea and lingering as long as possible in the stale communal warmth. I watched one worker chug-a-lug a half-tumbler of brandy like a dose of antifreeze before having another go at the elements. Outside, people had surrendered any semblance of fashion to the all-consuming struggle to keep warm. They hobbled along in clumsy black felt Valinki boots or animal skins, legs wrapped in woolen leggings, heads buried in fur. Coat collars were raised to hide every last inch of flesh from the merciless wind. "Stings, doesn't it?" muttered one of my companions, a Ukrainian newcomer to Yakutsk. "This is nothing," scoffed Yuri Semenov, a native Siberian whose grandfather was banished by the Tsars to Yakutsk when it was no more than a dumpy little village for political exiles, fur traders, and native Yakuts tending reindeer herds. "Our coldest day this winter was minus 72 Fahrenheit, he said. "In Moscow, people don't send their children to school on days like today, but our kids go down to minus 58. You think our climate as oi oi oi," smiled Miss Alexandra Ovechnikova, rolling her dark brown Eskimo eyes as I gratefully thawed a few minutes later in her office. Since '63, she had held the largely honorary title of President of the Yakut Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a region almost as large as all of Western Europe, and now exploited by the Soviet state for its incalculable riches of diamonds, gold, gas, oil, and untold other minerals. "But it is a very dry climate, good for health," she insisted. "You notice that our people don't get fat, and they live long lives. You have to dress warmly. The women wear woolen tights, one on top of the other, at least 3 layers, maybe 6. In Yakutia, wearing layers is a lifestyle. Even houses and cars do it, as we discovered driving around among the straggling settlements of log cabin huts with icicles hanging from the eaves and to the ground. In Moscow, Anne and I had become accustomed to double windows, but in Yakutia, storm windows are triple thick. Each layer has its little fortochka, or mini window, in the upper right-hand corner to control the airflow. In the Hotel Lena, the scruffy hostelry where we were quartered with an overflow crowd of workmen sleeping in the hallways, the fortochkas had thoughtfully been sealed to prevent draughts. In our room, the only link to the outdoors was a stove pipe, thrust through all the window layers, but someone had stuffed it full of old rags. Buses and cars, too, came equipped with double windshields to keep them from glazing over. Vehicles which could not be garaged overnight were simply left running around the clock. If they stop, advised our stuttering taxi driver, you have to warm them up with special heating devices, and it takes 3 or 4 hours to start them again. It's easier and cheaper just to leave them running. Man, it turns out, is more durable than machines. In December and January, when work at diamond mines or on construction sites slows to a crawl, workmen can take no more than half an hour outside without heading for the warm-up shed, but they have to give up entirely at 58 below because machinery breaks down and steel rods snap like twigs in the extreme cold. What staggered me was that in spite of these conditions, Yakutsk had grown to nearly 120,000 people and included a university, several scientific institutes, a television relay station, a full-scale port on the Lena River, its lifeline to the south, and several dozen small industrial enterprises. Indoor plumbing, however, was a rare luxury, even in the most bitter weather. Just as the joke about the Siberian toilet implied, people used outhouses. In a workers' neighborhood one evening, I peered into a couple of outhouses, and catching sight of frozen piles of excrement knee-high, I shivered at the thought of the cold midnight dash. It's worse for women, one worker conceded. Ordinary house water poses a problem too. Here and there on street corners were electrically heated spigots serving a section of homes, but 2/3 of the city population lived in sections without such conveniences. Their water came in the form of huge chunks of ice, sawed mechanically from the frozen surface of the Lena River, and delivered by truck or horse-drawn sled to be stored outside or in the basement. A hollowed cave in the permafrost beneath the houses. River ice cost 50 kopecks a square meter, and one lady vouched for it as the best quality water there is, especially good for the stomach, as its remoteness and the rigors of climate were not enough to contend with. Permafrost multiplies the difficulties and costs of any human endeavor. Yakutsk lies near the heart of the permafrost zone, which covers nearly half of Soviet territory, mainly in Siberia. As the name implies, permafrost is earth that remains frozen year-round to depths of 1,000 feet or more, unless its iron hardness can be softened, at least temporarily, I was told. Man cannot sow his crops, sink mine shafts to tap the mineral wealth underground, or even construct sizable modern buildings. This last point puzzled me, for it seemed that permanently frozen earth would provide the most stable possible foundation for buildings. The problem, according to Rostilov Kaminsky, a bearded young scientist at Yakutsk Permafrost Institute, is that the top 5 or 6 feet of permafrost thaw and turn into marshy swamp in summertime. Fine for farmers who manage to grow wheat, oats, cabbage, and even hothouse tomatoes in forest clearings, but it plays havoc with builders. I had already noticed homes tilted at rakish angles or ridiculously buried up to their window sills. Any normal building set flush to the ground, Kaminsky explained, generates enough heat to thaw the permafrost under it, and then sags into its own quagmire. The quirks of permafrost make roads heave and railroad tracks buckle like miniature roller coasters. The Yakuts have long accepted topsy-turvy cottages as an unavoidable inconvenience, but when modern Soviet engineers want to raise structures more than 2 stories high, there are obvious perils. The solutions they have devised is to set buildings on concrete stilts to allow the icy Siberian winds to circulate under buildings and keep the permafrost frozen, but this means penetrating the permafrost long enough to sink pilings firmly into the obstinate earth. One method is to bore holes, but the more common is more cumbersome. Expedient is to funnel steam at high pressure into the permafrost from a long fire hose contraption, thawing the earth temporarily. Then, with an ungodly clanking and heaving, a huge crane rams a 30-foot piling into the steam-softened pit by dropping it over and over and over until the sheer weight of the piling drives a hole to the desired depth. There, the permafrost seals its icy vise around the piling. This technique has caused construction costs to skyrocket, but Kaminsky said it enabled the Russians to build a new 7-story hotel in Yakutsk and a 9-story office building in the diamond town of Mirny, though I never did quite understand why such tall structures were needed anyway. It had been my dream to visit the diamond mines at Mirny, or the gold fields at Aldan, but the authorities refused permission. As a consolation, Yuri Semenov, the slender newsman whose grandfather had come as an exile to Yakutsk, who was my local host, took Anne and me on a fishing expedition that exposed us to other facets of Siberian life. In a sturdy old Volga taxi, we headed for the Lena River, which in summer months is the transportation artery that brings Yakutsk almost all its year-round supplies. As we approached the river bank and were preparing to cross, I suddenly realized no bridge, but the driver plunged onward, and soon we were bounding along on the river in an icy, rutted but well-prepared track. It's safe, Yuri reassured us. The ice is plenty thick, about 8 feet, strong enough for trucks. We were traveling on a regular winter highway used from December until late April, linking Yakutsk with settlements to the north and east. For nearly 15 miles we bounced along, passing an occasional truck, car, and even one motorcyclist. The curbs, so to speak, were marked not only by drifts, but with regular little pine trees to prevent snowblind drivers from mistakenly plowing off into deep snow somewhere in no man's land. We turned off the ice highway and clawed our way deep into the countryside, nearly slithering to a perilous halt in axle-deep snow several times before we came upon 15 Yakuts. In a large clearing that turned out to be a snow-covered lake, the Yakuts are an ingenious race of trappers, fishermen, and reindeer herders, with as great a mastery over the north as American Eskimos, to whom some Soviet anthropologists believe they are ethnically related. Since early morning, this team of men had constructed an elaborate fish trap. Through the ice they had bored about 20 bushel basket-sized holes, setting them out in huge oval nearly the size of a football field. Masterfully, they had stuffed large nets under the ice, threading them from one hole to the next. Then they knocked on the ice to drive fish into their nets. By the time we arrived, they were pulling in their third catch and had about 500 pounds of fish. They teased us into helping them pull in the nets and used great skewers to hoist flapping fish out of the freezing water. Within minutes, a couple of fires were crackling near a cove of pines, and the aroma of fresh fish soup, seasoned with salt, green onions, and herbs, quickened our appetites. The inevitable ration of vodka was produced, but before anyone could raise a glass to his lips, a smiling Yakut carpenter with the thoroughly Russianized name of Vasily Androsov solemnly dashed a portion of vodka on the fire, which flared brilliantly for an instant. It was a throwback to the ancient pagan worship of sun and fire among the Yakuts. The custom among our people, Androsov confided, is to pour the first drink on the fire for Bayone, the god of hunters and fishermen, a god of merriment like your Dionysus. It is for good luck. Siberia, Maxim Gorky once called it, a land of death and chains. The great 18th century scientist Mikhail Lomonosov glowingly predicted that its natural riches would eventually become the source of Russian might and power. Today the reality lies somewhere in between, neither so terrifying as the boundless prison without bars used by the Tsarist, Stalinist, and Brezhnev regimes for convicts and dissidents, nor so romantically bountiful as Lomonosov dreamed, yet both prison and promise remain. Even now, university students in Moscow and Leningrad shudder at the thought of being dispatched on 2 or 3 years of compulsory state assignments at some project in the remote, desolate territory, which stretches 3,400 miles from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific, officially divided into West Siberia, East Siberia, and the Soviet Far East. But as we discovered, many Siberians firmly proclaim their devotion to the beckoning solitude of the taiga pine forest, and vow they would never trade their stern existence or the free outdoor life of Siberia for the over-civilized, overcrowded, over-bureaucratized life of European Russia. I don't like the West, a young professional woman in Irkutsk remarked, not meaning London, Paris, or New York, but Moscow. I have a lot of friends there, but I don't like it. People are rude. They are in too much of a hurry. They are too tense. Out here, people are more friendly. They have that broad Siberian spirit. Again and again, I heard that sentiment. Back there, they are bureaucrats, a blunt-spoken Bratsk engineer commented disdainfully. Out here, we are Democrats, working together. For the loyal Siberiak, his is the land of manifest destiny, filling up with strong young people throwing hydroelectric dams across titanic rivers, planting mighty construction projects in the rich but untapped wilderness, building a new civilization, marking out the blueprint for the future. An unquestioning faith in economic growth comes gushing forth in a stream of superlatives about Siberia. This is all virgin territory, boasted our friend Yuri Semenov, with the kind of pioneer spirit that would have warmed the heart of Horace Greeley. People here have much more opportunity than they do back in the West. With grit and willpower, the settlers have achieved some striking results over the past quarter century. Hydroelectric dams at Bratsk and Krasnoyarsk, already world famous, are being joined by massive new power projects at Sion and Ust-Ilimsk. At Norilsk in the far north, a mining industrial complex refines copper, nickel, and platinum. Aluminum is being produced at Bratsk, Krasnoyarsk, and near Irkutsk. Power lines and pipelines crisscross the frozen wilderness, pumping gas and oil from Siberia not only to European Russia and Eastern Europe, but to Western Europe as well. Industrial development, growing slightly faster in Siberia than in the rest of the nation, is pushed hardest where it is easiest, in or near established cities on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, or in southern regions where the climate is less fierce than in Yakutia. When new towns sprout in the Siberian north, it is to tap vital mineral resources, and they are staggering indeed. The gas fields in West Siberia are claimed by the Russians as the world's largest, with bigger reserves than in the entire United States. The oil fields of West Siberia's Tyumen region shot in 1 decade from dormancy to become the Soviet Union's most productive area, outstripping even Moscow's ambitious plans. Siberia holds 60% of the timber of the Soviet Union, 60% of its coal, and 80% of its water power on giant rivers that, if linked, could encircle the globe 25 times. Not only are there lucrative deposits of gold and diamonds in Yakutia, but elsewhere are rare metals like platinum, molybdenum, and wolfram. In fact, practically every element in the periodic table of Mendeleev. So vast are the reserves that Soviet economists and engineers wave away Cassandra-like warnings of Western scholars that mankind is recklessly depleting the world's natural wealth. Siberia, they believe, can be worked for a millennium. The messianic enthusiasm of Siberia's boosters, however, ignores very real obstacles, especially the fact that living conditions are so severe that in the 60s nearly 1 million more people moved out of Siberia than moved in. Despite graduated pay bonuses designed to hold people there, each hardship region has a basic coefficient. In Yakutsk, pay is 50% over standard wage levels in what Siberians call mainland Russia. For each year in Siberia, the worker gets another 10% on top of that, up to 5 years. In some regions of the far north, bonuses run up to 200%. Only a few years back, some Siberian enthusiasts were predicting that its dazzling prospects would lure a population of 60 to 100 million by the year 2000. Yet, by the early 70s, it had reached only 26 million, with little likelihood of hitting 35 million by the end of the century. Not only have acute labor shortages slowed construction and put a crimp on overall Siberian economic growth, but ruble-conscious planners in Moscow have discovered that while Siberian mineral resources are plentiful, the cost of developing them and providing necessary facilities to attract workers are double or triple the cost of developing more accessible, if less dramatic, resources elsewhere. Nonetheless, for a nation that has lost its revolutionary elan without shedding its revolutionary pretensions, Siberia is vitally important as a political symbol of the new frontier. As each big showcase project draws toward completion, a new one is inaugurated. When I left Moscow at the end of '74, the propaganda buildup was underway for BAM, the Baikal-Amur Main Line, a railway to be carved through 2,000 miles of wilderness from Lake Baikal, the scimitar-shaped natural wonder of East Siberia, to the Amur River near the Pacific coast. The stated objective is to open up a remote mineral-rich zone of the Soviet Far East. Significantly, BAM will also provide a strategic rail route well north of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and hence less vulnerable to any land attack from China, perhaps the real reason for its construction. Poets and pop groups, as well as propagandists, have been enlisted to churn up a gung-ho spirit for BAM, which Moscow claims will be the feat of a generation, if not the century. If Siberia did not exist for those projects, the party would have to invent it, commented a young Moscow economist. Every generation has its big Siberian project. There was the Bratsk generation, now the BAM generation. I have been on one of those projects, and the conditions were miserable. The mosquitoes nearly ate us alive. They got into our hair, our tents, our food, everywhere. We komsomols worked like slaves from early morning to late evening. I made nearly 500 rubles that summer. At first it seemed like a lot, but I spent quite a bit getting there and living there. It didn't seem like so much money when I got home, but it's a way of getting the country mobilized. People know that the real dirty work is done by convict labor, added a Leningrader whom I knew. They know that most of the young Komsomol brigades are pressured into going out there, and that older workers go for the long ruble, the high pay bonuses. Still, it stirs national pride when people read, "We are building a new railroad across Siberia," or "We have built the world's largest dam." Notice the way these big projects are described, not so much for their precise economic benefits, but for transformation of the countryside. Their importance is more ideological than economic. Without that sort of thing, there would be no idealism left. Without those projects, how else would we know we were building communism? The Westerner who has not ventured across Siberia by rail has difficulty grasping the immensity of the Soviet Union. The brain is ill-equipped to comprehend the geographic meaning of a nation that encompasses 11 time zones. It is not ready to absorb the fact that Leningrad is much closer to New York than to Vladivostok. Americans are accustomed to conceiving their own country as continental in dimensions, but it shrinks next to the vastness of the Soviet's interior. The United States plus half of Canada would fit into Siberia alone. The 3,200-mile trip from Moscow to Irkutsk is like a flight from New York to LA, and yet that is only half the journey across the Soviet Union. The omens of a formidable passage appear even before one boards a Trans-Siberian train. Russians, who have a way of taking possession of a train as if it were a motorized wagon caravan, arrive at the station burdened with cheap, battered suitcases, boxes desperately strung together, gifts, toys, lumpy bundles, and unraveling packages. Before departure, they provision themselves with whole loaves of brown bread, hunks of cheese, rations of cold cooked fish or meat patties, and string bags bursting with sickly sweet Russian soda pop or watery beer. Once on board, they flood the interior and transform it into a mobile tenement, changing immediately into blue warm-up pajama outfits, gathering whole clans in their 4- and 6-bed compartments. The women peeling cucumbers or fondling children, while the men, scratching and yawning in their undershirts, play chess or squint at newspapers. In a world where the passenger train has all but passed away, the railroad still has magnificent mystique in Russia. The old first-class wagons, with their faded wine-colored curtains, quaint lamps, and dollies on the writing tables, and curved brass handles on the doors, have a turn-of-the-century romanticism that always made my wife feel like Anna Karenina. The borscht or solanka soup in the dining car may be served in institutional metal bowls, but in each car a samovar chugs and puffs constantly, its fire stoked by a plump and talkative attendant. ready to supply tea and sweet biscuits at any hour. The old Russian cars, built for the widest gauge track in the world, contained a special luxury for me: the longest bunks in my experience of train riding. On trains, too, Russians had the time and the nerve to gossip with strangers, and we talked with them at great length on trains. Our one concern as we headed for Siberia was that the train might be cold. It was a needless worry. Like all Russian interiors in winter, the train was so overheated that we burst out for fresh air at every available stop. The snail's pace at which we crawled was a great instructor in distances. Like some creaking merchant vessel patiently plying a vast inland sea, our train crept across the continental expanse. The Moscow-Peking Express, it was called, 5,630 miles in 175 hours, according to a notice in our car. We went only halfway to Irkutsk, but for 4 long days we stared out the windows at the changeless scene of gently undulating snowfields, giving way to forests of birch and larch, giving way again to snowfields. We felt like passengers on an ocean voyage, gazing out at the rolling waves. The snowbound hamlets, with their weather-beaten, smoking peasant izbas, floated past like unconnected islands, seemingly uninhabited in the sea of snow. I had imagined Siberia as having been filled up by the waves of settlers, much as the American West, but what impressed me most on that train trip was the sparseness of humanity and the enormous emptiness of the land. Cities would suddenly loom up without the warning of suburbs, and then, after we stopped briefly, would vanish just as suddenly. The petty barter from ship to shore marked the progress of our voyage across the continent. The dining car left Moscow well stocked with fresh apples, oranges, cucumbers, chocolate candy, and other little delicacies. At the early stops, townfolk would rush to purchase these goodies from the dining car staff, leaning outdoors in windows. But later, as supplies ran low and the menu became more restricted, the trade shifted the other way. Although there was only meager fare on shore at Zima Junction, we joined the rush of other passengers to the station kiosks for sweet buns, beer, and fresh newspapers. A few old crones, wrapped in black coats and woolen scarves, were hawking homemade pickles and steaming boiled potatoes at 25 kopecks a pound, while other women shoveled coal onto the train or chipped off icicles that had gathered beneath drains or had frozen up the couplings. Once I saw a woman batter off a chunk of metal along with the ice, looking at it, and walk away with a shrug. So modest and disappointing were the Ural Mountains that we crossed them almost without noticing the stripped post that marks the continental divide between Europe and Asia, the official beginning of Siberia. But after 2 more days of travel, we were aware of passing into another hemisphere when we reached Irkutsk. Droves of young Soviet soldiers back on a quick leave from Mongolia or post along the Sino-Soviet frontier and chasing local girls reminded us that China was near. On the train, I heard Russian passengers quizzing the car attendants about life in Peking. Other travelers who had covered the far eastern leg of the Trans-Siberian route talked of seeing Russian helicopter pads and troop installations from passing train units of massive garrison of 40 divisions and 1,000,000 troops that Russia keeps along its disputed frontier with China. Later I would hear of sealed zinc coffins coming back through Irkutsk in April, 1974, which residents presumed were from some undisclosed border clash. But then in 72, after Nixon had been to Peking, but before he had paid his first visit to Moscow, Russians nervously pressed me to explain why America was siding with China against Russia. So keenly do Russians feel their rivalry with the Chinese that I was repeatedly asked about our diplomacy with China, especially when I visited regions close to the frontier with China. On no other issue did private opinion seem to coincide more closely with the official line than in the deep-seated Russian fear and mistrust of the Chinese. Intellectuals talked of the Chinese as the new barbarians, peasants brainwashed in the fields with loudspeakers, life entirely militarized, people mindless with Maoism. That is the way press articles and television shows depicted China. It struck me as ironic that these Russian intellectuals had the same image of China that the West had of Russia under Stalin at the peak of the Cold War. Indeed, they talked of the Chinese as the new Stalinists. The Chinese military threat was another bugaboo. A Russian journalist back in Moscow from Byelorussia, a continent away from China, told me that people in Minsk were worried about war with Peking. In Moscow, mothers would talk about not wanting their sons to serve draft tours along the Sino-Soviet frontier, the way American mothers did not want their boys in Vietnam. In border zones or cities near the frontier, like Irkutsk, the hatred and suspicion of the Chinese seemed especially strong. At times people spoke bitterly about the bloodshed with the Chinese over Damansky Island in 1969. Over lunch one day in an Irkutsk restaurant where we shared a table with a young computer programmer, we got a dose of local anti-Chinese resentment, fanned, we were told by others, in closed political lectures from the far side of Lake Baikal, less than 50 miles to the east. The computer man said you could see Mongolia and China. It seemed too far away to me, but he insisted, in a candid imperialistic affront to the nominal independence of Mongolia. He talked genially of that country as our 16th Republic, an insult tantamount to calling Mexico the 51st state. Mongolians he liked, but not the Chinese. We used to have many of them here in Irkutsk, in our institutes and in our factories, he said. We taught them everything. Now they are gone, and look how they treat us. He was embittered by the Chinese polemics in the press and on Peking radio. Don't any Chinese come here at all anymore, I asked, meaning civilians or diplomats, but he took it militarily and bristled with chauvinism. No, 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 he declared. We have enough troops along the frontier to handle them. Here, everywhere, they can't come into Russia. My brother was at Damansky. We showed them there, and if they try something new, we will show them again. With that, he made a strong clenched fist, a characteristic Russian gesture of power. For Siberians, dams symbolize Russian might, just as do troops and rockets. They embody man's conquest over nature, and they are an article of the communist faith. In his drive to modernize Russia, Lenin preached, communism is Soviet power plus electrification of the entire country, and his apostles took him so literally that they have zealously been erecting what the poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko called temples of kilowatts. The particular temple that inspired Yevtushenko was Bratsk High Dam, which he immortalized in an epic poem, The Night of Poetry. In the Bratsk station, Russia, your motherly image, shimmeringly unfolded itself to me. Bratsk epitomizes the New Jerusalem, the Soviet blueprint for Siberia, a huge hydroelectric project feeding a cluster of new industries, a new city hacked out of pine forest beside a gorge on the rushing Angara River at an isolated spot 750 miles further north than Montreal. It was there I met Alexander Borosevich Gorovich, a Ukrainian Jew who typified the priesthood of Siberian true believers. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and irresponsibly ebullient, Sasha Gorovich had responded in his youth to the Communist Party's call for eager Komsomols to come build the world's mightiest dam and to hell with the hardships. He was an incurable romantic whose utopian faith in the wonders of industrialization was blended with undimmed 18th century idealism about the perfectibility of man. Perhaps it was only a pose, but true to his intellectual environment, he seemed oblivious to the disquieting insights of Freud or the implications of Stalinist terror, as he spouted catechisms of optimism from every culture. At breakfast, for he spent practically every waking moment with Anne and me during our 2 days in Bratsk, Sasha proclaimed his admiration for Jack London's Call of the Wild and for Walt Whitman because of Whitman's love of humanity. At dinner, he entertained and exhausted us with poetic recitations, including a flawless rendition in English and in Russian of Rudyard Kipling's "If You Can Keep Your Head When All About You Are Losing Theirs and Blaming It on You." Films like Andrei Rublev, which portrayed the time of the Mongol conquest, among other things, disturbed him because they showed the suffering of Russia and the dark side of its history. His two all-time favorites were Einstein's Battleship Potemkin and Shapayev, heroic epics of the 1905 revolution, and the legendary Red Army Civil War commander Vasily Shapayev. He was annoyed with the lifestyle of Russian youth, with their hunger for Western rock music, their hankering for modern fashions, their political indifference, their lackadaisical attitude toward work. What have they ever done that really counts? He demanded. In his own youth, he had been educated as a journalist, but had volunteered to come to Bratsk as a rock driller, he said, because he could not resist enlisting in the army of 54,000 construction workers building the nation's most vital project. When the party says you must, the Komsomols answer, "We will," Sasha declared with extravagant enthusiasm. When I repeated that old Komsomol slogan to people back in Moscow, many winced at the cliché loyalty, but Sasha was a party man, a lecturer in Marxism-Leninism at the local pedagogical institute, a propagandist who tried to tell me that we were all part of the international proletariat and that I should throw off the mental chains that made me think of myself as a middle-class American. Sasha claimed to have no regrets about having followed his spirit of patriotism and adventurism to Bratsk. Building that dam had been his finest hour. It was our October, Sasha enthused, comparing the 13-year struggle from 1954 to 1967 to erect Bratsk High Dam to the October Revolution in 1917. Like Jay Gatsby watching reruns of old college football games and imagining the roar of the crowds, Sasha took us to a movie on the construction of the Bratsk High Dam at a club where the director, one of his contemporaries, now in paunchy middle age, fondly remembered the dam as a monument to our youth. Nostalgically, Sasha relived every agonizing moment of the tedious transport of equipment up the frozen Angara in the depth of winter, the dynamiting of the gorge, the installation of the first stage cofferdams. He relished every miserable cold night without electricity in the early years. That's why we had such a high birth rate. No electricity and nothing else to do. He laughed. He remembered every mosquito bite. The mosquitoes attacked us worst in June. Just like Hitler's army, so we called them fascist. He grinned. By any standard, Bratsk High Dam is an impressive achievement. As we had flown northward from Irkutsk to Bratsk, we had caught glimpses of the dam from the air, a narrow line holding back a sprawling lake, locally known as the Bratsk Sea. Up close, the dam was mesmerizing as waters gracefully tumbled through its spillways and power lines hummed and rasped over our heads. Serenely it rose a sheer 400 feet, blocking the rocky Padun Gorge with a half-mile wide wall of concrete. A spur of the Trans-Siberian Railroad was superimposed on top. Not only was it gigantic, but it was the brightest, most modern, cleanest, best-maintained Soviet industrial installation that I visited. Merely seeing it, Sasha was a geyser of more superlatives than the engineers who built and ran it. Biggest in the world, he gushed. Well, not quite anymore, cautioned Lev Ablogin, the short, stout, red-faced deputy director of the dam. It had been the biggest when it was finished in '67, but its 4.1 million kilowatt capacity had been overtaken by a newer Soviet dam at Krasnovarsk with 6 million. But its output is the biggest in the world, Sasha insisted knowingly. Said Ablogin proudly agreed that as of '72, no other dam had produced so much energy in 1 year as Bratsk. Ablogin kindly took us through the dam and showed us diagrams and a map of the entire complex. Again, Sasha could not contain himself. Bratsk Sea was the biggest man-made lake in the world, he asserted. Well, almost, Ablogin responded. The Karibi Dam on the Zambezi River in Africa had backed up a larger lake, but he thought Bratsk Sea was second. Then, as Ablogin was explaining the pioneer frontal method of dam construction, Sasha quickly interjected that Bratsk High Dam was the highest in the world, built that way. Again, Ablogin had to qualify by observing that Canada was building a slightly higher dam by the same method at Churchill Falls in Labrador. Each answer pained Ablogin and pained Sasha even more because, like so many Siberians, and like Russians generally, they exulted in those words, biggest in the world, with a national pride in bigness that seemed to compensate for the burning humiliation that many Russians feel at being industrially second best to the West. As if suffering from an acute national Elvis complex, they grasp for any chance to compensate, which is one reason that so many officials meeting Westerners exaggerate Soviet accomplishments. Ablogin was unusual in his professional accuracy. Sasha was more typical. For most Russians, biggest means best. The dream of building the biggest was what had inspired Sasha and his generation, and Sasha could not bear to have that dream tarnished. His caustic disparagement of the younger generation was a reflection of his anger that they no longer cared about building a utopia, about being biggest and first. It was not from Sasha that we heard, for example, that close to half of the original 54,000 construction workers at Bratsk had left for other projects, or had gone back to European Russia because they could not stomach life in Siberia. Nor was he the one who mentioned that Soviet economist like Abigail Abagyan, director of the Institute of Economics at Novosibirsk, had singled out Bratsk as a prime example of helter-skelter unbalanced development because the builders had rushed ahead too enthusiastically with the dam, producing power by 1961, whereas its main intended customer, Bratsk aluminum plant, began production only in '66 and was not completely built for several more years. Piecemeal, the drab realities of everyday life in Bratsk came through to us. In its heyday as the nation's top priority project, Bratsk had commanded special supplies of food and other consumer goods, but now those priorities had passed further north to Ust-Ilminsk and other new projects. In March, we found the shelves of Bratsk food shops pretty barren. One housewife complained that fresh fruits and vegetables disappeared for the 5 worst winter months. We saw only a few scraps of meat, and people said it was seldom available. In a children's store, I happened upon a furious fight among mothers over an unexpected shipment of girls' underpants. A professional woman complained that cultural life was absolutely dead. I could not bear to live here if it were not for my long trip home to European Russia every summer, she groused. To me, what was most depressing was the naked Orwellian monotony of row upon row of identical gray prefab apartment blocks in the 8 settlements of Bratsk, officially designated Bratsk 1 and Bratsk 2, Bratsk 3, and so on. The one pleasantly rustic community was the old Podun township, where the early construction workers had been housed in wooden buildings, now repainted. The other settlements had been bulldozed out in the pine forest. Hardly any pines were left standing. I was told that Prime Minister Koshtin had chastised city officials for the numbing sterility of the architecture and for stripping the city naked of greenery. Elsewhere as well I ran into evidence of this dark side of Siberian development, yet I marveled at the Russian determination to keep throwing up large new communities. Bratsk had 160,000 people in the inhospitable regions of the far north in defiance of the elements, both natural and human. By dark side I do not mean the estimated 1 or 2 million inmates of Soviet labor camps legally condemned to work in Siberia, but the travails of ordinary people who pay a punishing price for the way the Soviet system has mounted its assault on Siberia. A few Soviet specialists have suggested putting only small settlements in the icy north to work the natural resources, reinforced in summer by labor and construction crews from larger, permanent settlements in more tolerable climates to the south. But so far, this is not the vision of Soviet planners. The development of towns like Nizhnevarodtovsk and Surgut in the West Siberian oil country is typical. In the mid-60s, both were sleepy villages of a few thousand souls. The oil boom transformed them. Now, at a latitude equivalent to that of Anchorage, Alaska, population of 48,000, each has shot up to 50,000 people, and Soviet blueprints call for growth to 150,000. They are to become hubs for development of oil and gas fields even further north. These 2 island settlements are set in frozen marshlands that turn into impassable swamps in spring and summer. Roads cost about $2 million a mile to build. The Ob River, the main supply line for all construction materials, is frozen from September to May. The payoff for the state is 60 million tons, about 420 million barrels of oil produced by the phenomenal Semolor field in '74. To show us that there was a payoff for individuals as well, local officials produced for a group of visiting Western journalists the chief of a champion oil drilling rig at Samolor, who said he earned, with all pay bonuses and hardship differentials, about $1,500 a month. An astronomical figure compared with the average industrial wage of $187. His pay was exponential, but other men made $500 to $600 a month, and oil trust officials insisted they had no trouble recruiting workers. Nizhnevatovsk was a classic Soviet company town where the local oil trust not only hired workers for all trades, operated the river port, and imported all goods and supplies, but arranged vacation trips, built and ran the bus system, the clinics, kindergartens, schools, and stores, and provided housing. Officials confidently told us that housing and community services were in excellent shape, though whenever we asked for a quick look, we were told our schedule did not allow time for it. The official version did not square with reports in the Soviet press or a few accidental encounters with local people, which made it immediately apparent that production came first and the workers were treated as pawns. No sooner had we returned to Moscow than Pravda ran a sharp critique of the very cities we had visited, chiding local officials for inadequate housing and services, charging that apartment buildings were being occupied without heating, water, or sewage, and with inadequate insulation. Other publications later reported that housing construction in the entire West Siberian oil region was only about 40% of what had been planned. An engineer from Nizhnevatovsk complained in a letter to the editor in early '75 that the city had not a single movie house, and workers felt lucky if they landed tickets to see old movies at the Oil Workers Club. Another workman from Surgut wrote that the Oil Workers Club there had been under construction for 7 years and was still not completed, an indication of the low priority of desperately needed leisure facilities. Soviet academic publications estimated that the cost of living in Siberia was 40 to 80% higher than elsewhere, eating up much of the pay bonuses. The Writers' Union Weekly Literary Gazette deplored the suitcase mood of the vast majority of workers who were going into Siberia on assignment for a short while, making big pay and clearing out. One article in August of '73 added the unexpected discovery that the most unstable group is the workers with the highest average pay. A graphic illustration of the hardships had actually greeted us when we landed in Surgut in a developing snowstorm. The airport was jammed with probably 200 people sleeping on luggage, sprawled on window ledges, and enveloped by an air of stale weariness that spoke of an interminable wait. Our 2 Soviet chaperones from the Novosti Press agency quickly shepherded us to a VIP lounge segregated from the Russians, but lingering by a newspaper kiosk, I was accosted by an angry woman with exhausted eyes, obviously taking me for a Russian in my fur hat and sheepskin coat. She burst out with the proposal that we go together to the District Communist Party Committee to complain. She said her family, and later I discovered many of the other people as well, had been stuck in that airport building with no indoor plumbing, no sleeping quarters, and only a pitiful little sandwich buffet for 6 days. 6 days, I asked incredulously. We have been in the airport 6 days, waiting for a flight to Khanty-Mansisk, about 250 miles away, she repeated. We have been living here, washing ourselves in the snow outside. The luggage room is too small to take our suitcases, so we sit on them. My 2 children should be in school. I have to take care of my family. We've been complaining, but nothing happens. Let's go to the Raikom Party Committee together, and maybe they can do something. It was not that there had been no flights, I learned, but that available planes were used for official business, or for the main runs, not for local runs, like the one she and others wanted. Another woman seated nearby, realizing I was a stranger, tried to stop the woman from talking to me. "Do you know to whom you're talking?" she admonished. But the first woman was so desperate she would not desist. "What does that mean, to whom I am talking? You don't need to butt in." But by then one of my official Soviet guides reappeared and insisted that I join the group in the VIP lounge. Within a couple of hours, when the weather cleared, we left on another flight, but the crowd in the airport remained. The common explanation by Soviet officialdom is that the raw new Siberian towns, as rough as Dodge City in its early days, are for the young who can take the bumps. Come summertime, loyal Siberiaki insist the enchantment and freedom of hunting and fishing in the open Siberian country and the arrival of supplies by riverboat compensate for the rigors of winter. To a certain extent that is true. The big cities are too crowded, a 23-year-old factory worker told me in Bratsk. People there are always pushing and shoving. Here it's peaceful and quiet. In summer I like to go hunting and boating in my outboard on the Bratsk Sea. Yet it was in Bratsk that Deputy Mayor Alexander Semyonov rather candidly conceded to me that juvenile delinquency, car theft, and radio hooliganism were a problem among a restless young generation that lacked a strong sense of purpose. That was symptomatic of broader problems. The early idealism had faded, Semyonov said, and many young people found the new reality bleak and humdrum. It was hard to motivate them. It does not sound so romantic to talk about running a timber factory and an aluminum plant as when we were building the dam and a new city, he acknowledged. In other words, the New Jerusalem of Bratsk had been more successful as a community during the raw, muscular enthusiasm of its construction era than as a utopian blueprint for permanent communities of the future.